Hello, media theory people. Today we're going to talk a little bit about McChesney and the problem of the media. This is a rather lengthy PDF that I posted, but you're welcome to read the whole thing, but I really want you to pay attention to the first chapter, and that's what I'll be talking about today in this short lecture. So right away, I want to answer the question, what is McChesney doing here, right? And sorry about that, what he's doing is he's trying to debunk the ideas that the U.S. media are inherently the province of the free market, and that our modern commercial media system is the result of informed debate. So what does this mean, right? We need to unpack this statement a little bit. So what McChesney is saying is that the U.S. media are usually considered to be governed by the free market. So that is to say that they operate according to laissez-faire free market capitalism, meaning that they're part of a competitive economic marketplace where people, which if it operates properly, is a situation in which people get to choose which forms of media they like, what they enjoy, and that these different forms of media that they enjoy will then prosper, right? While others that they don't like will die. So this is the basic idea of laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire is the French term that literally means hands off. So the idea is that the government has no part in it, and ultimately it's just sort of the people who decide, what newspapers they like to read or what newscasts they like to watch. So right away, McChesney is saying, listen, this isn't how it works. It's not even how it was intended to work. He says that the media system has been set up as it stands today to serve the interests of those who make the policies behind closed doors, primarily large profit-driven media corporations, while the broad and vital interests of the population have been neglected, right? So he's making an argument that's based in political economy, which is something we've been talking about through our past few readings. He's interested in power, government regulation, and the production of media texts and cultural texts, right? And he argues ultimately then, using this political economy strategy, to say that our current media has become an anti-democratic force. That indeed the way that it works is not really the way it was originally intended to work, and that it doesn't really benefit us all, right? In our roles as informed citizens participating in a democracy. So he begins his argument by talking about the importance of media. The question is, why should we care, right? And he says media are at the center of struggles for power and control in any society. And they're even more vital players in a democratic society, right? So the idea here is that the media can certainly influence people with regard to political ideology and motivate them to vote in different ways. If it's working properly, of course, the idea is that it informs these people with a variety of viewpoints that they're then able to consider intelligently and then make a choice accordingly, right? So this is, media, he says, is really at the center of the struggle for power. And so it's really important when it comes to a democratic nation because it's the instrument that informs the populace, right? That informs all the people. And based on this, he says virtually all theories of self-government, which we do, right, self-government in a democracy, are premised on having an informed citizenry. And the creation of such an informed citizenry is the media's province. So what he's saying here is that it's the media's job to tell us what's going on. And it's only when the media tells us what's going on that we're able to make the kinds of decisions that we need to make in order to make our democracy successful. So he goes on developing his argument. He says, in the United States, the starting point for grasping the problem of the media is seeing where the media system fits in the broader capitalist economic system. So again, here we're talking about political economy. He says, listen, we need to think about the media in terms of capitalism and how it figures into our larger system. And he says that there's a tension, right, with this role of media in our current system. He says the crucial tension lies between the role of the media as profit-maximizing commercial organizations and the need for the media to provide a basis for informed self-government. So then, the tension here is that in capitalism, and according to the rules of our capitalist system, the media is a profit-driven entity, right? Or composed of profit-driven entities. So they want to make as much money as possible. But this motivation to make all this money exists in a tension with the idea of informing the people, of doing a public good, informing the citizenry so that they can create a better union, right? The one doesn't necessarily serve the other. And so he says it's this tension that fuels much of the social concern around media and media policy making. So this is what people get upset about. This is what a lot of the arguments are about when it comes to the media. Today, most of these arguments center around things like Facebook and Twitter, right? Social media, where there's a concern that these are very definitely for-profit corporations, but they also serve as sources of information and news for millions of Americans, right? So what does that mean? How do we figure that out? How do we deal with the fact that their number one goal is to make money, not inform us, but this is where people are being informed, right? So he says, we tend to think that media are a natural province of the market. So we tend to think in society today, we're so used to our news being given to us by these profit-driven corporations that we just think that's the way it's supposed to be, right? And we also think that when our government regulates these markets, when they create laws that govern how these media corporations operate, right, that this represents an outside intervening force. Indeed, this way of thinking is sort of baked into our economic system, into our neoliberal capitalist system, right? But he says, even though we think that's true, a free market approach is not the natural manner or the natural way to organize a media system, right? And he goes on, and he says the U.S. media system, even its most free market sectors, is the direct result of explicit government policies, right? So he's saying that this free market system didn't just create itself naturally. Indeed, it's a product of government regulation, and that it wouldn't even exist without these policies. And so to sort of further his argument, he then says the dominant media firms exist today because of government-granted and government-enforced monopoly broadcasting licenses, telecommunication franchises, and rights to content. So what he's saying is that the government created the rules or the laws that made these dominant media firms possible, right? So then the real struggle, he says, is over whose interests the regulation will represent. So the question becomes then, right, like who benefits from these laws? Is it the people who are supposed to benefit from these laws? Or is it the corporations that appear to be the ones who are really benefiting? So with this in mind, he says that the term deregulation is misleading. And many of you probably already know what deregulation is supposed to mean. But if you don't, I'll tell you, right? When we talk about deregulation, we're talking about trying to limit the amount or get rid of the government regulation of markets. So what this means is that in theory, the people choose what works and what doesn't in a market by buying what they like, right? But what McChesney is saying here is that deregulation is misleading. He says that it means more often than not government regulation that advances the interests of the dominant corporate players. So what he's saying is that when we take away rules or laws that govern the media, it really benefits the big corporate players in media, right? Because they have less rules that they have to play by. And so to dominant firms, when government allocates to them lucrative monopoly licenses or I have no idea what I meant to write there, or regulates on their behalf, it is not considered regulation. But to society, it's a serious form of control. and one that results from explicit media policies made in the public's name. So, for example, you or I could not go open up a cell phone company tomorrow, right? Much of the cell phone industry is regulated by the government, including the availability of the actual wavelengths to send these cellular calls, right? And so as a result, when the government hands out these licenses to operate these telecommunication franchises or licenses, what they're doing is the people they're giving them to, they're essentially giving them a kind of monopoly, right? And so what they're doing is they're saying, here you go, right? Like here's a license to print money, and it's being given to you by the government in our name, right? Back in the day with broadcast TV, there were only a certain allocation or number of broadcast wavelengths that could be licensed. And the government decided who got those licenses. You or I couldn't have opened up a radio station or a TV station on our own. So by regulating this content and by only letting some people, regulating these mediums, these channels of communication, they're limiting our ability to compete, and they're doing it in our name because they're our representatives. It's our government, right? So what McChesney is concerned about in many ways is the recent growth over the past century of the media as a profit-making business, right? He's worried about the fact that the media is driven by these huge conglomerates, right, that own all kinds of different entities. Like Disney, for example, controls literally hundreds of different media companies that all produce media, but ultimately are owned by Disney, right? And so it's this huge profit-driven company. And it's just in the past 100 years that media have become really an important location for profit making, right? If you go back more than 100 years, the media wasn't a big business at all. And so over the past 100 years, it's become a place where people have gone to make lots of money. And and he says the 8 or 9 largest media firms now rank among the 200 or 300 largest corporations on the earth, right? And so the question becomes, what are the potential consequences of media being tied up with corporate capitalism? Well, the answer to that should be fairly clear, right? The concerns are that capitalism, right, has a tendency to create economic inequality. And because these media firms answer to investors first, right, it could make it so that the media, rather than helping to enhance our democracy, weakens our democracy, right? Even more so than that, commercial media could be useful to capitalism because it generates a political culture that's more enthusiastic about capitalism and suspicious of people who criticize capitalism, right? So you have these huge capitalists running these mega corporations that are making all our media. And so the concern is, number one, this can create greater economic inequality. And number two, that it promotes the capitalism that made the capitalists rich in the first place, to the detriment of everyone else, right? So it's reasonable to expect that a media system that would serve the interests of the wealthy would denigrate the interests of those at the bottom. So here again, you have this argument about economic inequality and who ultimately is benefiting from this monopoly corporate media situation that we have today. McChesney then goes on to say, listen, the system, we think that our U.S. media system is just naturally profit-driven, that this is the way it was meant to be. But he says, no, this isn't the way it was meant to be at all. And so it's here that he begins to go into a kind of historical review that dominates the rest of this chapter. And he begins with an examination of copyright. And he says, in the U.S. Constitution, Congress is authorized to establish copyright. And the whole idea behind copyright is to address the public good nature of media property. And so now it's important to understand a public good, right? Public goods are different than other goods that are created by other industries, because when you consume a public good, like a book or a newspaper, right, it doesn't diminish the ability of others to consume it as well, right? So I can read a newspaper when I'm sitting at McDonald's drinking my coffee in the morning, and I can lay it down, and somebody else can come along and pick up that newspaper and read it, and it doesn't, like my use of that newspaper doesn't diminish it at all. And that's not like a car, right? Where if I drive the car's worn, right? The car's, like if I drive a car for 100,000 miles and I send it to you, it's probably not as good a car as it was when I first used it. But the newspaper's just as good. So then the question becomes, how do we deal with these things that are public goods that can be reused again and again and again? And so, right, one of the problems with a public good is that anyone can publish a book without the author's permission, right? And the author wouldn't be compensated. So in a world where we have these public goods, right, where anyone could reproduce them or people can sort of endlessly use them, right, there is no impetus in a free market like ours for people to keep making these goods. Why would I sit down and write a book if anybody could publish it and make money off of it, right? There's no financial incentive for me to keep creating. And so for this reason, the government created copyright. And copyright is a government intervention. Indeed, it's an anti-free market intervention, right? We think of ourselves all the time as free market capitalists, but the reality is there's some situations where free market capitalism wouldn't work. And this is one of them, right? So the government intervenes and they say, listen, if you write something, you can copyright it. And when you copyright it, you'll have a legal monopoly over your book, right, whatever it is, your album, for a limited time, just to make sure that you have an incentive to write books, right, so that other people can't steal your product and sell it, right? And so the whole idea behind copyright is specifically to intervene with the free market. And so he says this is an example of why the U.S. media system is not naturally profit-driven, right? So he says, thus, in its best light, copyright was a policy made to benefit society by encouraging cultural production. The founders were concerned with the idea that if people weren't incentivized through copyright to produce books, newspapers, albums, movies, of course they didn't have these things at the time, but these are all cultural artifacts, right? If they weren't given an incentive by the government to create these things, then society wouldn't be as rich, right? But rich, I mean culturally and right, not money-wise, right? And that it was important. It was particularly important in a democracy to have an enlightened citizenry, to have an informed citizenry. Because if the people get to vote, if the people get to decide how they're governed, if the people get to decide about their government through voting, then they should be informed. And if we don't incentivize people to create books and other kinds of information, then they wouldn't be informed. And then our democracy would be poorer for it, if it survived at all, right? So then, after examining copyright, he looks at the notion of the free press. So here he's talking about the First Amendment to the Constitution. And he says the founders' concept of a free press is not what we imagine today. When we think about a free press today, we think about basically reporters being able to say whatever they want to say, right? And that's not what the founders had in mind. Indeed, when the founders wrote the Constitution, newspapers were funded by political parties. So they were not instruments of corporate corporate profit-making entities, right? Instead, they were funded specifically by political parties and heavily subsidized through government through printing contracts. So let's say your party comes to power and your party has been sponsoring various newspapers. Well, one of the things you could do is give government printing contracts to those publishers. And this helped pay for the press. So the idea of the press as a commercial activity set up solely to meet the needs of its owners was an unthinkable idea. This was simply not something that the founders considered, right? They didn't think that it was going to be a money-making activity for large private corporations. So because of the need for an informed citizenry, right, the founders believed that the press should be heavily subsidized to benefit democracy. So subsidized meaning, given financial resources and/or created so that it was financially easier for publishers to do their thing. And the Post Office Act was adopted for this reason. Now, of course, the Post Office Act created the post office. But people think, when we think about the post office today, we think about paying your bills or sending a letter to mom or something like that. But this isn't why the post office was originally created, right? Indeed, by 1832, 90% of the post office traffic was made up of newspapers. So when Benjamin Franklin was coming up with the idea of the post office, it was primarily as a medium of mass communication, right? He was interested in the post office being used to distribute newspapers to the citizenry so they could read these things, be informed, and then vote, right? Then play an active role in their democracy. And so the post office really was a mass medium. It was a way of getting out information to a large number of people, right? And it was created primarily not to send letters to mom, but to distribute information, right? And so this is another way. Of course, the post office is largely government funded, and so it's this is another thing that indicates that the U.S. system, media system, is not naturally profit driven, right? It's heavily subsidized. It's been helped out by the government exponentially, right, throughout its system. So we have the post office, but we also have public education that operated as a subsidy for the press. We encourage states to set up systems of public schooling, which in turn creates a literate populace, and that literate populace then consumes newspapers and books and so on, right? So in this sense, the founding of public education acted as a subsidy for the press. Public libraries, which states were also encouraged to create under the Constitution, also contributed to this whole movement of subsidizing the press, right? The idea that you could go and get your hands on books. And indeed, these libraries bought books, which obviously put money in the pocket of publishers, which helped further their business and helped further the dissemination of more information. And again, all this was based on the idea that an informed public was essential for a flourishing democracy. There's a commercial that played during the Super Bowl with Larry David. I think it was for cryptocurrency. But in it, Larry David is like hanging out at Independence Hall with all the founding fathers of the United States, and they're writing the Constitution. And they're talking about how everyone should be able to vote. And Larry David says, even the dumb ones? Even the stupid people? Right? Like, he's surprised by this. And they're like, yeah, even the stupid people. So it's kind of a funny commercial. But it does speak to this idea that the founders of our country were very concerned about the populace not being informed, about the dumb people voting. Right? And so they took measures. They took measures to subsidize the press, to create a literate populace. They did everything they could to make the government work towards furthering the media, because they saw the media as being essential to informing people so they weren't dumb and they didn't go vote in stupid ways that weren't in their best interests or weren't in the interests of democracy. So again, the whole idea was, yeah, we'll let the dumb ones vote too, but we're going to do everything we can to make the government help create an informed public. And the way the public gets informed, again, is through media, which gets back to the notion that the U.S. system is not naturally profit-driven. Indeed, it was never really meant to operate that way, right? From the start, the U.S. media system was supposed to be an integral part of our democracy, and one that was supposed to be heavily subsidized and heavily encouraged by the government in order to create a bunch of educated voters. And so what McChesney is getting at here overall is that, this profit-driven thing in media is relatively recent. It's really developed over the past century. But if you go back far enough, you'll realize that this was never the way things were supposed to be, never the way that we imagined things to be. And so at the end of the chapter, he gives a pretty nice summary in one paragraph. He says, understood this way, the crucial issue then becomes how these media policies and subsidies are generated. What is the nature of the policy-making process? In the first generations of the Republic, these policies were subject to relatively widespread informed public participation and debate. The resulting policies reflected such public involvement. So again, what he's saying here is that the U.S. media system was originally closely tied to government. It was an integral part of what the Founding Fathers saw as our system of democracy, and that it was supposed to be the duty of government to help subsidize the media system and to be actively involved in it, right? And so then McChesney goes on and says, over the course of the 19th century, and certainly by the 20th century, as large commercial interests began to dominate media markets, the public's role began to shrink. And this, of course, is the problem as he sees it, right? So McChesney, as a scholar, is all about political economy. He's all about who owns what, media ownership. He's all about media regulation and deregulation, as you can probably tell from this article. And he's concerned about all these things because ultimately he's concerned about the media not performing the role in this country that it was meant to perform as part of a viable and flourishing democracy. All right, that's it for this lecture. I hope you learned something, and thanks for checking it out.